Hello, everyone. Last homework assignment before our exam. As I've mentioned already, we'll be doing our exam review on Friday. Please come prepared to ask questions and feedback as necessary for that. And then we will be doing our exam on Monday. Just as a kind of a little quick detail for the exam, I will go over my exam policies in a lot more depth on Friday, so everybody's aware. But I did want to let you know. My exams are roughly the same, consistently the same from semester to semester. I do make modifications to them to update in detail and to make a little bit of variance in there. So the reason for that is that I try to make sure that I'm being tested or having my students being tested on a consistent basis. That being said, if for some reason, like I ask you a question and 90% of the class misses a question, I will consider whether that was a fair question to ask. I try to modify my exams and make sure that at least the questions are fair. But I do believe that over 50% of the students miss a question, then I evaluate whether that question is reasonable or not. I will go ahead and say that there are some questions I expect over 50% of the class to miss because there are concepts that I mentioned many times in class, and then I test on those concepts, and for some reason, students just overlook that. I try really hard to mention things multiple times if I think it's important. So if you've heard me say something multiple times in class, such as UML diagrams are important, you probably should take that into account when you're preparing for the exam, because that's something that's 100% chance that I'm going to ask questions on. Yeah, that's kind of a tradition for all of my classes, is that there are certain topics that are very challenging and very difficult. I 100% expect more than half the class to miss it. But I also spend a lot of time talking about those specific topics. If you heard me mention something multiple times in class, bring it up many times over and over again, so much to the point that you're sick of it, you probably should take that as a clue that that's something that I'm going to be asking you questions about. Today's homework, there are some questions in here that I'm a little bit dicey on. There was actually one question that I tossed out from this homework assignment from previous assignments, but there's another question that I was going through when I was preparing for today's class. I really don't like it. I try to avoid trick questions. I left this question in because I want to talk about it, but I do think that it's not the type of question that I would ask on an exam. Also, the discussion questions that I had you answer, I do want to make a note that the discussion questions were more about the aggregated UML diagram, which I've already told you, you do not need to prepare an aggregate UML diagram for the exam. Do you need to know it? Yes, you need to know all the components of that. You should be very familiar with how the aggregate diagram works, particularly with the components that overlap. That's going to be really important. That being said, it does not ask specifically about the conversion UML diagram, which I think is an oversight. I don't think there are any good questions in there that talk about the conversion UML diagram. Does that mean I will not ask an exam question about it? Not necessarily. I may still ask you about the conversion UML diagram. Just because there was not a homework problem about it does not mean you're not responsible for it. So please make sure you keep that in mind when you're preparing for the exam as well. That just because something was not specifically referred to in the homework doesn't mean you're not responsible for it. I do think the homework is a good, valuable experience. It is not a comprehensive experience preparing for the exam. So let's go ahead and go through some of these questions then. So which of the following is an activity in the conversion process? Well, we start out with a pretty easy one. Again, when you approach questions like this, do not automatically default to the last answer. Don't default to all of the above. As I said on the exam, it's very rarely a correct question. In fact, as I've mentioned before in class, the reason I often use all of the above is because I can't think of a good fourth answer. So usually I'm trying to find something that I can just fit in there. And I was like, oh, all the above sounds good. It's not meant to fool you. It's meant to test you to make sure that you know the concepts really well. This question is not like that, okay? This question is pretty easy. So ask which of these are activities in the conversion process. Authorized production, that's pretty straightforward, yes, okay? That's why that's one of the beginning steps, or the beginning step in the process, the production authorization. If we are going to produce, we need raw materials, so we got to issue raw materials. We've obviously got to perform work, that's the whole conversion process itself, and then transfer completed work to finished goods. This was not much of a test of your knowledge here. That being said, the approach is more important than the question itself. Make sure you look at every individual answer to understand that they meet. We will not always, in fact, very rarely on the exam, we will not always have all of the questions be correct. So please make sure you're aware of that. So E is the answer for this one. This is more, question number 2 is more like one of the type of the question that I would ask about on the exam. Remember, we talked about the activities model for the BPMN diagram. There were only 4 activities. But one of the most important aspects of that model is understanding where do the transactions lie on that activities diagram. And this specifically asks about a particular transaction. Which of the following activity results in work in process moving to finished goods inventory? So the transaction is debit finished goods inventory, credit work in process inventory. What is happening in that transaction? Well, the answer is we are completing production. We are finishing production. So you need to understand how that activity fits the transactional diagram. And I might ask you, where does the transaction fall in the diagram? Or I may ask you, look at this transaction, which activity would this be in the diagram? Either one of those is fair game. There will be questions on that for all three process areas. So you need to understand how the transactions fit within the diagram itself. So the BPMN diagram, that would actually be complete production, C, okay? Moving to question number 4. Which of the following is not a purpose of using lanes to describe the conversion process, all right? Now, to be able to answer this question, we need to reiterate what's the difference, what does a lane indicate in a BPMN diagram? So remember, we talked about pools and lanes. And these will actually come up on the exam as well, because we've talked about the nature of those. A pool represents an entity. So if we're talking about our organization, that's an entire pool. If we're talking about an external organization, that is a separate pool, okay? So that's kind of how we dictate within BPMN diagrams. Pools are just separate organizations or separate entities. Lanes are departments within an organization. They represent different activity areas within an organization. So we're talking about items that represent departments within the conversion process. So let's just go ahead and go through these. Document the sequence of activities in the process. Does that actually use lane analysis? Do we need to actually consider lanes in documenting activities? Not really, okay? Because we could actually represent the activities in a linear function. In fact, we do in the simple diagram. So the purpose of lanes or having different departments doesn't actually dictate the sequence of activities. Again, that is a horizontal depiction, not a vertical depiction. So A is probably our answer, but let's go through the rest. Expose potential problems and handoff between organizational units. Do those lanes represent different units in organization? Yes. Okay. So B, it would be the purpose of using lanes. Show important decision points. Identify responsibility for those decisions. Well, that probably is a good point because the decision point represents handoff between different organizational points, and responsibilities would say who's responsible, which department's responsible for certain areas. So I'd buy into C. Establish internal control activities such as segregation of duties. That's probably an important one to understand what responsibilities would go with different departments in the organization. So yeah, I think B, C, and D are all valid. A is not a valid one, so A is our answer. Again, don't default to E. You need to analyze all of these. Question number 5. I do not like question number 5. I think this is a trick question. I really, really despise questions like this. And by the way, for those of you who are going to be taking a professional exam, this is just kind of a little anecdote. This particularly relates to me as I'm preparing students for the CPA exam. The ACCT has told us time and time again they don't try to trick students, and yet I see questions that are just ridiculous, okay? So I don't want to say that you will not encounter trick questions as you prepare for professional certification exams. They will come up. That doesn't mean that I like them, and I will try to avoid asking you trick questions on the exam. If I ask you a question that's going to have a particular purpose or focus, this one I think is really, really miserably worded. So the way the following is which of the following is a business rule implementing access control for the conversion process? Now, in order to understand this, we need to reflect back on what business rule represents. So remember our definition of business rule. Business rules are process constraints that ensure information systems operate in a consistent and effective manner, okay? So basically, we can view a business rule as a transaction constraint for the system. So what can a transaction do and what can a transaction not do? An example would be a transaction should not be a modification, okay? A transaction should not be modification without approval or something like that, okay? Should or should not, can or cannot, basically how we view transactions going within and out the system. The problem with this is that business rules, these transactional constraints, these business rules can create internal controls. And that's a good thing because we need to have internal controls in place. The problem is separating out the idea of a business rule versus an internal control. So a business rule is basically dictating what the transaction should do within the system. The internal controls say, how do the employees and the system itself regulate activity within the system? Why am I going through all this rigmarole? Because if you look at each of these examples, none of these are business rules. These are all internal controls, okay? Now, is that a fair question? Absolutely not. And this is not a question I would ask you on the exam. One thing I would expect you to know that is actually relates to this question, if I say, which of these controls are access controls and which of these controls are application controls? Because we've got 2 access controls and 2 application controls. So let's just do that real quick, because it actually specifically talks about implementing an access control. And we want to say, well, it looks like 2 of these are access controls. How do we identify access controls? What word are we looking for? Employee, okay. When we look at the system, those are application controls. Employee activity represents what we would assume is an access control. Application controls are dictated by what the system does or can't do, okay? That is what I would expect you to know. I would not expect you to differentiate between the idea of a business rule versus an internal control. Is it an important distinction? Probably, but I don't think this does a good job of making that distinction, this particular question. So if you're really, really frustrated and want to put my evaluations that I gave you a terrible homework question, that's fair, okay? I did do that thing. Moving on, question number 6. Consider a UML class diagram of the conversion process that uses the RA framework. Which of the following events begins a typical conversion process? Now, this is an interesting question because we kind of jumped over this question because it's such a complex diagram. There's so many little dip points. By the way, I want to look at this diagram real quick. So I said that you're going to be responsible for this diagram. You do not need to worry about these items in the middle, like the bill of material, labor plan, or dualities. If I actually depict this diagram and you excluded those, that would be fine, okay? Additionally, your multiplicities here, they are not in a vacuum. If you don't have a multiplicity that matches what I have here, as long as you can explain the multiplicity, that's all that I ask for, okay? Now, if your multiplicity makes no sense, it will be counted wrong, okay? So if you say there could be 0 employees involved in material issuance or many employees involved in material issuance, I say, okay, if there's 0 employees, who's issuing materials? It's like, well, we're operating in a non-manufacturing environment. I say, well, why do we have a conversion diagram then? And then I've got you, and then you have to actually admit defeat. You have to tap out, okay? You have to physically tap out when that happens, all right? And anyway, obviously I'm getting off track here. So there are some things that I want you to look forward to, but again, I am pretty lenient on interpretation of this as I realize that this is not something that exists 100% in one direction. That being said, I will provide you some context for a lot of these questions, so you don't need to panic if you don't feel like you've got this perfectly new match. That being said, let's go ahead and look at this. What would be the event that we would think that would actually cause this start? We've got 3 events: material issuance, labor authorizations, and production authorization. What would have to happen for any of the other events or any of the other activities take place? We would have to have a production authorization. We'd have to have a request from, we have to have a request for more goods to be created, because we look and we see there's not enough inventory to meet demand in the future. There needs to be more inventory created. So before we can ever issue materials or issue labor, there has to be an authorization for new goods. So right in the center here, this is our originating activity, all right? Now, I know this is a little bit confusing because we have materials up here. We say, well, materials issuance is the first activity dictated in the diagram. The sequence in the diagram often will dictate where it takes place, but not always. Since this is a central linchpin and since it associates with both of the resources that we're going to be doing, and we have to have activities that associate with those resources, it just is intuitively sensible to have materials issuance up here and labor operations down here. Because if we put these in sequence, production authorization would go here, and then all of a sudden trying to create that association is a nightmare. So that's why we don't depict it that way. Intuitively speaking, this is a question that you would not answer according to what the diagram looks like. You would ask, just from an activity perspective, what makes sense? So authorization production has to be the first thing that takes place. We can't do any production until it's been authorized. Once that happens, that's when the materials flow in, that's when the labor flows in, when all the other events take place. All right, question number 7. Hold on, did I answer question number 6? Okay, yes, authorized production, so B. Question number 7, which of the following describes the purpose of a labor operation event? A labor operation event. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the diagram. Here's our labor operation event. And basically, this is a point where we say we're adding labor to the process. Now, how is that depicted according to the answers? All right, so let's go ahead and go through these answers one by one and make sure that we have some understanding here. So I'm going to tell you right now, it's not none of the above. It's going to be one of these, all right? So labor operations activity, add the cost of direct labor to the work in process activity. That sure sounds like something that we've done. That sounds a lot like what we did in 221 when we talked about adding that in. Because remember, we recognize labor as it flows into work in process. Admittedly speaking, this is not a complete answer, but I would say that this is probably a good answer. At least it covers part of it. So I want to put a pin in A and I want to look through the rest of the answers. Control the specific labor activities. Is that we're doing in the labor operations? Are we controlling all specific labor activities? We're actually only controlling labor activity for this particular process, so that's a little bit beyond the scope of this process. So labor operations, I would say, probably not the answer, okay? Ensure that labor is performed. Again, that's one that I would say is probably along the right step, but again, we're trying to identify for the specific activity that we're looking at. So that one's a little bit beyond scope. And then identify production employees. That's not going to be for labor operations because that actually relates to more of what the agents are. This would be this relationship right over here for the employees. So the answer is going to be A. Again, I do not think that's a complete answer, but I think that's probably the most relevant answer with respect to how we are identifying the purpose of labor operations event. Is to make sure we understand when labor flows into work in process, when we're adding that labor. Okay. Question number 8. Which of the following is correct posting of a foreign key to implement the model of a relational database? Now, this one is a little bit dicey, but this reflects on something we've already talked about. So I want to go ahead and I want to talk a little bit about each of these. So we've got labor operations, the primary key and foreign key and production authorization, products become primary key and foreign key and bill of materials, blah, 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 blah. So one of the things that I told you to make sure you identify in this is you had to understand what multiplicities are existing in these relationships. So let's just go ahead and do this, okay? Labor operations and a primary key becomes a foreign key in production authorization. So what's the multiplicity that's in our diagram? So we'll start labor operations to production authorization. Labor authorization to pump production authorization. It looks like a zero to many multiplicity here. Okay. Then products become a primary key and primary key becomes a foreign key in bill of materials. Okay. So products primary key. Oh, sorry, we're looking at an expanded diagram. So I guess I should probably have that higher in there. Products primary key becomes a foreign key in bill of materials. So products 1-to-1 bill of materials. So 1-to-1 relationship. I'm just going to read these off so I don't have to go back and forth. The products categories primary key becomes a foreign key in sunset partners. Now sunset partners is not listed up here, but remember our partners, they're employees. Okay. So if we're talking about product categories becomes the primary key and the foreign key in sunset partners, we're talking about a zero to many multiplicity. And then products primary key becomes a foreign key in product categories. So again, a zero to many multiplicity. So we have 3 0 to many multiplicities and 1 1-to-1 multiplicity. What did I specifically say when we talked about this back in chapter 3 and chapter 4? What kind of multiplicity has to exist for a foreign key to be used? Has to be a very specific multiplicity. I'll give you a hint. There's only one that actually meets this criteria in the examples we looked at. A 1-to-1, okay? Why? Okay, why is that the case? Let's just go ahead and look at the examples. I've got production authorization to labor authorization codes. Now, I basically said that you can have one product authorization code can have many labor authorizations, okay? Have many labor authorizations. So I'm creating the production authorization table and I say, okay, what is my code for labor authorizations? I would have to put many items in this particular code, okay? I'd have to put many different labor authorizations because I can actually have multiple labor authorizations for a single production authorization. That violates our rules for creating a relational database. We can't have multiple items within a single field or a single cell, a single record. Okay, we would actually have to create multiple instances of this. So this multiplicity violates the rule of a foreign key. All right. The same thing with employees here. Employees are managing different product lines, okay? So we have one employee who's managing multiple product lines. I have to list out all the product IDs they're managing. There's going to be multiple fields in this cell, which we can't do that. We can't have multiple IDs within a single cell. We have to have one input. That's one of the required rules. Same thing with product categories. A category can have multiple product IDs. We can have different categories of signs. So we could have like signs 1, 2, 3, different categories, different types of signs. So product IDs, multiples exist there. The only one that this meets is going to be bill of materials. For every bill of materials, you can have one product and one product alone. That's what it specifies. So bill of materials 567 ships this product ID right here, and that's it. So we can actually use product ID as a foreign key in bill of materials because it meets that multiplicity. Now, again, this is something we've already talked about. It's very confusing, and I will buy into it that you'll be like, I'm not sure, I'm not 100% certain about this, Dr. Martins. That's cool, I get that. What you need to remember is, if you have a multiplicity that's not 1-to-1, it cannot be a foreign key, okay? It cannot be a foreign key. Technically speaking, we could probably also have a 0-to-1, but I'm not going to confuse you with that. I will tell you right now, if you see a multiplicity that has a star at the end of it, it absolutely can't be a foreign key because that will violate one of our assumptions that we have one input per cell. Okay. So that's basically how we describe this particular situation right here. And that being said, that means that our only answer can be B because we can have bill of materials can have products as a foreign key. Okay, question number 9. Which of the following describes the purpose of the bill of materials class? So again, this is in our diagram right here. We've added this as a class. This was not in our previous diagram, and I talked about what was the purpose of including that. So what do we call this particular class? Is it a resource, event, or agent? Sure doesn't look like any of those. What is that term for a class that's added just to provide additional information? Conceptual structure, okay? This adds additional information. It doesn't fit the categorization of the other ones. And it basically depicts the relationships between materials and products. How would you, if you were to explain, and remember, this is raw materials and finished goods from the previous diagram. Either one of those terms is fine. They can be used interchangeably, okay? How would you describe the purpose of including this class here? We're saying these are the materials that are eventually going to be converted into our finished products. Is that a fair assumption to make that statement? Is that the relationship that we'd assume materials to products here? That's the whole purpose of conversion right here. So the bill of materials is dictating what materials are going to be eventually included into the conversion of finished products. So what is this answer going to be? Let's go back to our question. Oops, I keep wanting to click on that Word document. We're not there yet. Okay. So it says, record the planned raw material contents of each finished good. That sounds like the conversion process to me, and that sure looks like what that bill of materials is trying to depict. So B is going to be our answer here. B is going to be our answer. Again, conceptual structures, I won't test you on explicitly, but you do need to understand what their purpose is in a diagram. If I asked you about that, you do need to be kind of depict what could be represented by conceptual structures. Okay. All right, so next is going to be discussion question number 3. Think about UML class diagrams for sales and collection process described in chapter 5 and purchase and payments process chapter 6. So our revenue process and our purchasing process, and want to know those UML diagrams, which I'm getting you to think about those now because they will absolutely 100% be on the exam. If you were asked to prepare an integrated model that shows these two processes as well as a conversion process, where would the models intersect or integrate? Why and what elements are unique to each process? Okay. So I'm going to skip the last part of this question. And the reason why is because I have already told you that you need to know how to create all three UML diagrams. Okay. You need to know the components to that. So the ones that I've given you in the slides, those should be your basis, and those could be used, the basis that you use from moving forward. Let's go ahead and talk about the ones that are consistently used across the diagrams. Okay. So again, this is not only just understanding which ones are common between the diagrams, but which ones are they used for. So we have 4 different elements that we've looked at in these UML diagrams that cross boundaries. The first one is pretty easy, okay? So we have a resource that is used both in the revenue and the purchasing process. What is that resource called? Cash. Yes, we exchange cash, okay? If we're on the purchasing side, we give it to our vendors. If we're on the sales side, we collect it from our customers. So that's going to be one resource, all right? Then we have another resource that is common between our purchasing process and our conversion process. Which one's that? Yeah, it's going to be our materials or our raw materials, whichever you want to call those, okay? We can refer to those as based on our raw materials inventory, but basically when we purchase something for a conversion, we're purchasing for the purpose of converting, so we actually acquire those goods, okay? Whatever term you associate with that, as long as you're clear that that's basically the unconverted merchandise, the unconverted inventory. On the flip side, we've got one from the conversion process that's also common to the revenue process. What do we call that one? Products or finished goods, okay? That's basically when we converted the materials to inventory. All right, so that's 3. We got the materials, we've got cash, we've got finished goods. And I think it just asked for the resources here, but I'm going to ask you one more. We've got one more class that's an agent that is common to all 3. Which one is that? Employees. The employees are involved in all 3 of the processes, okay? That's going to be depicted in our diagram, which we're going to see here in just a second, all right? So that's really important to note. What are the common elements and what processes are they involved in? Okay, so that's basically something you should remember. Now, are the other elements important? Yes, but keep in mind that they are unique to those classes. And they're not difficult questions to ask. If I were to ask you, all right, what are the events that occur in the purchasing process? You can say, well, there's the purchase, and then there's the cash receipt, or sorry, the cash disbursement, excuse me. All right. What are the resources? Well, we just talked about cash. We also just talked about materials. And who are the agents? Well, there's going to be the ones who's doing the purchasing, the employees, and there's going to be the people we purchase from, which are suppliers or vendors. So even if you don't remember the UML diagram, you can stop in the middle of the exam and say, I know this, Dr. Barnes talked about this in class. What are the resources, events, and agents? And you know enough about purchasing and revenues that you should be able to answer that question and create at least somewhat a reasonable diagram based on that. Now, the multiplicities are going to be a challenge all unto themselves. I recommend that you interpret those on your own. If I ask you to create those, then you're going to have to make sure you also can interpret those as well. But that being said, that's a longer problem a lot down the road. At the very basic level, the UML diagrams are just interpretations of the information we already know. All right, so moving on to the final question. Final question based on this says, describe how you would change figure 7.7 to implement an activity-based costing system with 3 different. Oh, right, that's not right. Okay, that's 6. Whoops. Okay. Let's take figure 7.7 in the context of the overall supply chain. Start with purchase and payment process, and ends with the sales and cash receipt process. How would you expand to describe Sunset's entire supply chain? So the way that I want to approach this is basically a creation of a UML diagram, a full integrated UML diagram, which, like I said, you do not need to create one for the exam. There may be some of you who want to create for the exam and just show out how much you've learned in this class. If you do, great, okay? You will get a brownie point, okay? May not actually count for additional points on the exam, but a brownie point is good enough, okay? I don't know, that probably won't make a difference between your grades, but you know, it'll impress me, it'll impress me. That being said, I did ask you to do it for this particular diagram. Now I want to take a look at what the solution says, and I want you to point out the problems with the solution. So this is basically what the solution gives. This diagram that I keep clicking on, this item that I keep clicking on, okay? This is the full UML diagram that's provided. Now you will notice that there are some interesting issues with the diagram. It actually does incorporate pretty much everything that we talked about in the conversion process. We got a materials and products, we got a production authorization, then our issuance of materials and labor operations. There do appear to be some missing associations, okay, or maybe some included associations that don't necessarily need to be here. Then we have our employees here that are called Sunset Partners. But I want to look really quickly at the call of the question, because this should jump out at you almost immediately. This diagram is fine, but it's incomplete, okay? And we want to talk about why. Because you will notice, that in the question it says, all right, starts with the purchase and payments process and ends with the sales and cash receipts process. How would you expand to describe Sunset's entire supply chain? What are inherent activities within the purchasing, or within the, let's talk with revenue and sales. What are the inherent activities? What are the inherent events that we have to include within the revenue process? Obviously the sale, okay, that's part of the name, but what else? Cash receipts. It actually says that in the question, sales and cash receipts process. Look at the diagram. Where are the cash receipts? They don't exist, okay? Can we say that that's an oversight? Should we have cash receipts from our customers as part of the supply chain? Yeah, it's very difficult to manage the supply chain if you're not receiving cash, okay? Similarly, you will notice we don't have cash disbursements up here. Are cash disbursements left out? Yes, okay? We've got an entire resource that's not been depicted in this diagram. So technically speaking, your diagram should look more like this right here, which admittedly is just the diagram that I used in the slides, but it's more holistic. It does not include the multiplicities, which I've already told you that you don't need to include. Won't need to replicate this diagram and a whole lot its full consistency. That being said, if you did replicate this with full multiplicities, points to you. Okay, you impressed me. The ultimate goal here, though, is not to actually say how we expand this, because the expansion is really easy. It's more about understanding how do all three of the UML diagrams integrate with one another. And the key to understanding that is to understanding what classes overlap, which we just talked about. Once you identify the classes overlap, all you have to do is stack the diagrams one on top of another. It's not clean, because you will remember that we talked about cash. Cash is not a common element for a conversion process, but it sits right in the middle of the conversion process. Why is that the case? Because it's really hard to put it anywhere else. Other than that, this is a very clean interpretation of what's happening within all three processes as they're integrated to one another. And I want you to think about that as you're preparing for the exam, is that the revenue process, the purchasing process, conversion process, None of those three processes exist in a vacuum. They do not operate independently. They are definitely dependent on one another. And this is what this diagram is trying to depict. So ultimately, this is kind of our optimal goal for all of these business processes, is to understand their integration and how they work with one another. And with that, I said we were going to be done early today, so I am done. I will see you on Friday for the exam review. Have a wonderful day.